Now, I have worked with the deer industry in New Zealand as a client of my production agency, Perry Media, now for over 7 years. And I want to confidently say that in all my experience, they are one of the most proactive industry bodies I've seen with embracing the need for farm environment plans. And this was over a decade ago to make them mandatory for their farmers, and a lot of self-auditing. And this reflects deer farmers' knowledge and understanding of deer behaviour. Yet they haven't been able to express the unique differences and practicalities of deer farming in the high country when it comes to consultation with this freshwater policy. So joining us now in Sarah's Country is Deer Industry New Zealand Chair Ian Walker. Good evening, sir.
Hi Sarah, how are you?
Good, thank you. Now, what are some of those main concerns, that were in your submission as an organisation to ensure that these unique concerns were heard?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of those concerns operate around the behaviour of deer in particular when they are grazing. So there's some specific behavioural characteristics, and I'm talking about things like wallowing and enjoying water and that sort of thing, which has been reasonably important to get a clear steer about that in terms of the outcomes required from the freshwater policy.
So for those viewers that are watching that are not familiar with deer behaviour in terms of wallowing from the wild into when we started farming and raising deer from the 70s onwards, what do they do that has that detrimental environmental impact?
Deer like to find those little wet areas where they can, and they dig a bit of a hole and like to get in there and play in there, cover themselves with mud if they can get that opportunity, particularly in warm weather and during the time during the roar, which is in the autumn, and it's probably just part of sort of territory marking as well. So it's quite an unusual characteristic, but I think we're all well aware of it, and I think that I know that in actual fact the deer industry has been looking at some of the environmental concerns in terms of handling those animals. Back to 2004, I think, was the first publication which we made about recommendations for farming deer and preserving and looking after the environment.
So stock waterway inclusion has been at the forefront of the deer industry for some time with fencing off of waterways, and of course 98.3% of dairy farms in New Zealand are fenced off. Why is there certain areas that's not practical in our high country farming of deer?
Simply because a lot of the deer are farmed reasonably extensively in in the high country foothills of the South Island and in hill country. So that makes them they're not as overall not intensively farmed as some other species are. So I think when you get into some of those foothill areas and that sort of thing, wide open spaces, tussock land, there's multitudes of creeks and waterways which form the headwaters of some of the major rivers, and I think that if you try and exclude animals from those waterways, it would be just about impossible, I think, in terms of fencing.
Deer Industry in New Zealand is, of course, I imagine, in support of the need for a freshwater policy and being a part of a catchment in a community.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've been I wouldn't say looking forward to, but are aware it's going to occur, because I think we actively want to make sure that water quality improves, and farmers want to leave their property in a little bit better position. And I think that one of the other interesting things about this overall water policy, I believe it involves the whole of New Zealand, not just farmers, but also urban people as well. So I think this is an encompassing policy which will be it's important for all of us, and we all need to buy into. So the deer farmers have been very positive about it, and I think there's been quite a long process for a year or two up until the policy statement was released, and there was all sorts of innuendo about what it could possibly contain. And certainly our organisation has been very active and generally working alongside Beef and Lamb as well to make sure that we understand what's going on and make recommendations or submissions on that policy.
Yeah, and that's there's 22 reports that Minister David Parker took into account, as well as the 17,500 submissions. In Deer Industry New Zealand, and levy payers from the deer farmers invest heavily in science, and in particular environmental science as well. Was your voices heard, do you feel?
We like to think it was heard, and certainly some of the changes that have, or recommendations that have been made, actually answer some of the concerns that we raised as an industry. So, and I think that the submissions in general, there were some consistent themes, as I understand, but we were quite pleased that some of the particular aspects have been taken into account and have given us a bit of space. And I think that the other really important thing, Sarah, at the moment is that because there's been so much speculation about what it may entail, and whereas now we've got some certainty. There's a point. We just got to wait now for the detail to become available. So the regulations are going to be written, and as I understand, they're being written at the moment, and then we'll know exactly what's in that policy statement.
And as an organisation, Ian, to show that leadership, to be able to bring all farmers on board together collectively around this policy, what will your organisation be doing to encourage better environmental practices?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things that have been occurring for some time, which you sort of referred to earlier on. We've aspired to having all deer farmers having farm environment plans, which is just a record of some of the environmental challenges and key points on their farms, and actually have a plan towards mitigating those risks. And so that was, as a policy for Deer Industry New Zealand, was just over 2 years ago. We decided we wanted to get everybody to have those farm environment plans. So I think that's been really good. The other thing is that we've engaged with quite actively with some science projects with ag research. And even at the moment, I think we're about halfway through a major project where, as I recall, I think there's 10 properties throughout New Zealand where there's intense monitoring of the streams coming from those properties, which, looking at the E. coli and the nutrients and all that sort of thing, and the water quality characteristics, and trying to get a link between the outputs that we can measure and the behaviour and the farming intensity and practices on those particular properties. So that'll be particularly good, and those outcomes, because after all, we're really interested in the science of what we need to do rather than perception, because perception is not always backed by some decent facts.
Well, we certainly discussed that last night with Federated Farmers Bernadette Hunt with regards to Southland's anti-wintering grazing campaign. So a lot of challenges, and thank you so much for all your work. Before you step away, we're talking about dogs and our first dogs, and we value and love our dogs in rural New Zealand. What was your very first dog, Ian?
First dog I had was an eye dog and called Bossy. So there you are.
Bossy. What a fantastic name. Thank you so much. That's Dr. Ian Walker, the Chair of Deer Industry New Zealand, joining us there discussing the deer industry's concerns around some of the practicalities of our freshwater policy that is currently undergoing the final detail around regulation, but not to say they are not in support of it in its entirety, which is fantastic.
This is Sarah's Country.